topic of the talk is about the Septile series. And the Septile series has always fascinated me. I think I've sort of been using them on and off for about 7 years, but in a very basic way, just using a few keywords that actually seem to work for myself and seem to work for the clients' charts that I did. Then when I thought of a topic for this year, I thought, well, I'd really like to actually do something a bit more comprehensive with the Septile series. And so the idea of my approach was to put aside the kind of keywords that I'd used in the past and to try and get together a whole lot of charts of people who had septiles, like famous people who had a lot of septiles in their charts, and see if I could build up a sense of what it meant from actual sort of experience. That was I think it's a really good way of doing it. The problem being that when I went to do it, is that 3 months or so that I've been preparing hasn't been long enough. It's something that really needs probably several years to do, because the septiles are very largely about internal type of experiences. To really understand how the septiles have worked in an individual's life, you need to know them quite well often. And so I've sort of been wading through all this biographical material, trying to gather the strands together. So this is really like a preliminary sketch. I sort of, after having done this, I feel like I'd like to do it at a much deeper level. The idea was, with the septiles, to try and give you a sense of what they mean through showing you particularly artwork, to give you the experience of the septiles rather than actually telling you this is what it is. Now, just before doing that, I'll just explain a little bit about where they originate. All aspects come from dividing the 360-degree circle by numbers. So if we divide the 360 degrees by 2, we get 180 degrees, or the opposition, roughly across there. When we divide by 3 into 360 goes up 120 times 3. So we get the trine series of aspects, which are indicative of, say, the relationship between Cancer and Pisces, or Aries and Leo. The 4 division by 4 gives us the square, which of course is indicative of the relationship between the cardinal signs, or the fixed signs, or the mutable signs. So it's 90 degrees. The division by 6 gives you the sextile series. Division by 8 gives you sesqui-squares and semi-squares. Now the division by 5, by 7 and by 9 generally have been ignored. And what I think I've certainly felt through doing this work is the realization of just how important they actually are has come home to me. Probably the best person to read, I think, is Addy, and his works on harmonics. And he, I think, has got kind of the best understanding of what makes these work. So the 7, division by 7 has always been associated with mystery. It shows the need to tune into the wholeness. 7 is to do with inspiration and creativity. I'm going to calm down for a moment. one of the things I hate about giving talks is when I've got to do a lot of last-minute details, and that's what today has been about. So, the way that I feel about them is they're a bit like Neptune in the chart. 7 to me has a lot of the connotations of Neptune. That they, just as Neptune shows an area where you can receive inspiration, then the septiles in the chart also show the sort of receptivity that you have to inspiration. So they really show what inspires you, what turns you on in a sense. And that's in an erotic sense as well. Addie found that the 7 series and the 5 series show quite a lot about the sexuality of the person. And, you know, to me, Neptune's a lot about the ideal that you have, the kind of dream that you have, the kind of fantasy that you have. And 7 has that connotations also. It's what inspires you at an erotic level, as well as, say, at an artistic level. Now, when you look at the charts of particularly musicians, creative artists, and religious people, spiritual people who seem to be very much definitely committed to a spiritual pathway, then you find the Septile series very prominent in their charts. An example would be Mozart, who has, I think, about 13. He has, combining the septile and the quintile series, he has 19 of septile and quintiles in his charts. That's without aspects to the ascendant of the midheaven. So, in many ways, they're the major feature of his chart. And yet, if you were just looking at the major aspects, you wouldn't actually be taking that into account. What I feel with the 7, as with any of the outer planets, when they're aspected with personal planets, it's like that they show you that area where you're open to the divine. And it depends a lot upon your own personality development, how conscious you are, how much your ego gets in the way, whether that inspiration coming through can be the source of, say, a great work of art, or whether it can just be the source of an inflated sense of ego. So I think it's very dependent on how conscious we are, how we tune into our septiles and quintiles. That for many people, they often, particularly in their 20s and 30s, may be dormant areas seemingly dormant areas of their charts. And it's when you really start developing consciously that you can start to tap them. The septiles have been associated with a strong sense of fatefulness in the life. That it seems to be the area where the collective need moves into your personal life, where you, at certain points in your life, have to put aside your own personal needs and rise to the good of the whole collective. And particularly with some of the people that we'll be looking at, that's very, very obvious in their life. So, some other things it does is it's the conditions in which we become receptive to inspiration. And it's the ability to sense the mysterious whole underlying everything. It also shows what conditions are actually needed to stimulate creative work. So, I think I'd just like to perhaps start with the slides. wonder if somebody might just turning off the lights. Just like to look at, let's begin with the Sun-Moon Septile. Out of all the charts that I did, I came up with 4 that had this. And to me it seems to bring the challenge to really utilise both sides of the personality, both sides of the person's being. That potentially the person can be inspired by the past, which is the moon, and it's particularly so, I think, I think when you're looking at sun-moon aspects, the actual sex of the person becomes very important, because obviously men generally tend to identify with the sun in their chart, and women often seem to identify more with the moon. So the thing that seems to come through is the women that have the sun-moon septiles have often had to try and carve out a life for themselves, perhaps in a time where it was less easy to do so than today, that they've had to actually go out into the world and make some sort of impact. And Blavatsky, whom some of you may be aware of, I think is a really good example of this. She's a very good example of both the positive potential of the septile and also, I think, the negative. She seems to have been a channel to have brought through a lot of esoteric knowledge into the West. That in a symbolic way, the West, which is much more sun-centred, Blavatsky seemingly was able to inspire, to bring new life to, through tapping into the past, through tapping into the East, which has always been much more moon-orientated. She initiated the Theosophical Society, which as astrologers we should all be very grateful towards, even though in many ways they sometimes seem to have partly in some ways outlived their purpose. But at the end of last century, they were the ones that were responsible for bringing about a sort of a resurgence of interest in Indian things in the East, but also in astrology and a lot of the esoteric things. And Blavatsky had an extraordinary life. She was born into Russian nobility. At the age of 17, she decided that she wanted to get married, and in a very short space of time nabbed herself the husband that she wanted. After 3 months of being with him, she ran away because she couldn't stand him, which was quite shocking in its day. It was just, something that just wasn't done. Her life was one that was full of fateful sort of incidents, and the difficulty with looking at her life is that the story that she gives over is often a little bit different from what other biographers have been able to find out about her past. Particularly, there's a 7-year period where what she says is that she travelled through the States and South America. She, in South America and in Central America, she studied esoteric doctrine. She met a man who she said was one of the masters, one of the hierarchy of masters, who told her, instructed her that she was here for a very important purpose for humanity. Also during that time, she said she went and fought in Italy under Garibaldi, dressed as a man, which I think is wonderful for a sun-moon septile. And then travelled through India and particularly travelled to Tibet. And the first time she tried to get into Tibet at that stage was closed to outsiders. She was rejected, but she tried again and got in and was, according to her story anyway, she received training under some masters in a Tibetan monastery. Now, the problem comes is that she's in many ways quite a Neptunian sort of figure. There's no way that you can look at her chart, particularly when you look at the amount of septiles and quintiles that she has, and not believe that she is obviously has enormous mediumistic potential. She was, I think, obviously had real clairvoyant ability, and I believe that a lot of the stuff that she wrote down actually was inspired. But she kept on, she seemed to have a real need to kind of prove herself, and would keep on arranging sort of really ridiculous stunts that undermined her credibility quite a lot. For instance, there was one in New York, in the Theosophical Society in New York. The then president invited her to dinner, and there was a distinguished doctor there, and Blavatsky was determined to enamour herself to him, and was, a wonderful conversationalist. She could be very powerful, as you can see by looking at her. But at some point during the dinner conversation, there was suddenly an enormous kind of kerfuffle at the door, and this apparition came racing in, holding an envelope that and muttering gibberish, which Blavatsky translated as that it was a message from the masters for her. And she ceremoniously opened the envelope and said, "Oh, such and such hasn't been, a certain individual hadn't been accepted to go into Tibet." The upshot of it was the doctor left in a huff, because as what was very obvious to the other people in there, it was actually a laundry, a female laundry attendant, what do you call that, a laundress? Laundress. That she'd actually paid to get up in this ridiculous costume and come racing in. She had something called it wasn't I think it was called the ethereal post office, in which letters used to drop from the ceiling. And again, in one of the places where this happened, they found that between the ceiling boards there'd been a knife cut, so that just for the right size for an envelope to fall through at the appropriate moment. I think that's not to denigrate the power of what she's achieved. I think that in many ways she's a very good example of the collective need working through her very powerfully, and the impact on Western thought that she had was enormous. But again, perhaps at the personality level, her own sort of stuff kind of getting in the way. It's another shot of her.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think anyone else would like this band turned off? It's marking okay.
It'd be great, wouldn't it?
Do you know where the switch is?
other examples of sun moons septiles were Wagner, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with his music. I don't like Wagner's music. My lover does, so I've sort of had to get used to listening to it. Again, what comes through with Wagner is that he produces very powerful music, obviously very inspirational music. His ideas and his explanations about the music, and often the texts that he wrote to go alongside with the music. He mainly wrote opera. They're not gibberish, but the music, the feeling that he puts into the music is much more powerful than his ideas. In fact, he was rabidly anti-Jewish, and some of the texts that he put out were just awful, and in fact showed a real kind of deficiency in his thinking in many ways. But again, it's really interesting. To me, the sun-moon septile potentially is about like a kind of a sacred marriage between the two inner aspects of the person's being. And the piece of Wagner's music that everyone is probably familiar with is the Wedding March. Out of all the music that he wrote, the Wedding March is the thing that has is the most accessible to everybody. I'm going to cover him more later. There were some very unsavoury aspects to his personality, and they come up a lot in the Quintile series. Sun-Mars septiles. The most obvious example I have of this is Winston Churchill. It's potentially the ability to kind of shine in situations requiring force or requiring leadership, that he really came into his own element when Britain went to war, and very soon after the war finished, he was suddenly dropped as Prime Minister. But he had enormous power to kind of motivate people, to inspire people to work and to keep fighting. And he's really strongly associated with the fighting spirit of England. A side of him that's not so, perhaps people aren't so commonly aware of, is he was also quite, was reasonably talented as an artist. I mean, he wasn't another Picasso, but if you see all the paintings on the wall behind him, they're all his own work, and he did have a couple of exhibitions in his lifetime. Again, this is a scene of him in war-torn Britain, and in all the shots that you see of him, all the pictures you see of him from that time, he's just radiating confidence and kind of the ability to take charge. Now, I think obviously the kind of in the area of combat or fighting is the most gross level that one could imagine in terms of a Sun-Mars septile. Krishnamurti and Ramdas both have Sun-Mars septiles also. So I wonder if you could just read the Krishnamurti.
If we get the light.
If you can get enough light there.
Yes, can I get enough?
Oops. He's going on a journey.
Yes, this quote from Krishnamurti. In passion, there is not the slightest shadow of fulfillment. Therefore, there can be neither frustration nor pain. Passion is the freedom from the me which is the centre of all fulfillment and pain. Passion does not demand because it is, and I'm not speaking of something static. Passion is the austerity of self-abnegation, in which the you and the me is not. Therefore, passion is the essence of life. It is this that moves and lives. And when thought brings in all the problems of having and holding, then passion ceases. Without passion, creation is not possible.
I think particularly that last line, passion, without passion creation is not possible, is really symptomatic of that sunrise connection. I think in its higher sense, it's looking at one's ego drives, looking at passion in one's life, and really trying to find a transcendental use for it, which he certainly seemed to. I think he seemed to really get into really understanding what passion and desire means for the individual. Oops.
Did we muck it up?
Adolf Hitler has a Sun-Saturn septile in his chart. And one of the things that he projected to Germany was he was the inspirational father. He's obviously, I think, a negative example of Sun-Saturn, but a lot of that relates to his upbringing. His relationship with his father was hideous. His father used to whip him from the age of 4 onwards every day with a hippopotamus whip. And at age 11, when Hitler had packed his bags and he was going to run away, his father discovered him. And his father beat him so hard he nearly died. He went into a coma. And so what seems to have happened with Hitler is all the negative potential of discipline and structure seems to have been both experienced in his life and then very much projected out onto the world. What's often lost track of is that in Germany, particularly as he rose to power, he was also seen as in a kind of as the positive father, and he was the scene of a lot of adoration, which you can see. I mean, and particularly in the bottom picture, Hitler and the faithful. I mean, if you get up really close, you can just see on the person's faces that here is the answer to all their problems. That he is providing the way out of the dilemma that Germany was in after the war. And there were there was a lot of propaganda emphasizing that aspect of him. He talks a lot about the fatherland too in all his speeches. So, yeah, a very negative kind of use of that energy. Another example is in terms of his sexuality. He seemed to need to be dominated sexually. There's a woman that committed suicide, and it was an actress that he was having a relationship with, and he used to require that she would squat on him and urinate on him, and he would say what a bad person he was, and she would have to kick him, and so there was real sort of aspects of domination in many kind of aspects of his life. In many ways, see, I'm quoting one aspect out of these charts, but the whole chart has to be taken into consideration, and Hitler has a lot of quintiles in his chart particularly, which are associated with the use of the will, and that definitely comes through also. A more positive example would be Cézanne, who was one of the post-impressionists painters, and what happened with the Impressionists is that they really wanted to kind of capture light and the sense of atmosphere. So they really started, in a sense, to break down form. What Cézanne did is seem to take that a little step further. This is a portrait of him at the age of about 36. He did a lot of portraits of himself, largely because he was very shy, and he used to get incredibly irritated by his human subjects moving. He would take incredibly long time to paint. For instance, he gave up on one painting after 100 sittings because it didn't sort of reach the kind of degree of perfection that he wanted. This is a portrait of his wife. Again, he did quite a lot of her. In none of them, even in the images of when she was a lot younger, he paints her in a very sort of, she looks quite old in all of the images, and also in the images of himself. He actually started to, in his paintings, he started to look younger as he got older, which is a very Sun-Saturn type of condition. So what he started to do was to break things down into the planes. Very much in his painting, it isn't so much the human element that's important, but the structural elements of the painting. You can start to see there that the way that the table is tilted towards us is not exactly how it would be in real life. He was very much concerned with finding the structures underlying the outer reality. And again in this you can see that although it is showing, this is the card players, although it's showing some human interest, again it's mainly the structural elements. And as he, in later life, that just increased more and more until the planes are obviously have nothing to do with reality. But they also have a sort of have a sort of consistency of their own. They do work, even though they aren't strictly realistic. This is an image by Toulouse-Lautrec, who has a Sun-Uranus septile, which you would expect to be somebody who is open to new ways of thinking, be open to the sort of bohemian aspects of life in his day, which he was. He also used to work incredibly quickly. He used to spend most of his time in cafes and lived for a while in a brothel. And this is a very unsentimental picture of two of the prostitutes in the brothel, who often used to have lesbian relationships. He's most famous for his posters, which are, if you've ever seen them, they're just like 3 or 4 lines often. They're just very, very quick sketches. And his main interest was in capturing the moment, in that fleeting moment, just the momentary impulse. He was a bit of an outcast. He was born into very well-to-do Paris, French society, but broke both of his legs at the age of 11, and so when he grew up he had the body of a man, but his legs had stopped growing. So he found his acceptance in the so-called senior side of Parisian society. He also has a Sun-Pluto contact, which I think comes out in the brothel kind of scenes. William Blake, this is a prophet called A Prophet in the Wilderness, who was a visionary artist. Associated with a lot of the revolutionary thinkers of his day, he tried to exhibit at the Royal Academy, and his work was severely criticised. So after that time he started to just engrave books to prepare his own material. And in a lot of that he put forward ideas that were reasonably revolutionary for the day.
Winston Churchill exhibited at the Royal Academy.
Did he? Oh.
That's a comment between the two.
Right. This is
what the septile was that Blake had?
He has a Sun Uranus.
Sun Uranus.
Yeah. And this is a Sun Neptune septile, Gauguin. And in Gauguin's work, a lot of these people were working around about the same period of time, which is why I chose them. And many of them come under the category of the post-impressionists, but their work is actually very, very different. Spiritual themes and feelings of mystery and religion tend to pervade Gauguin's work. He was totally possessed by a dream of what he called primitive society. He has a combination in his chart of Sun, Neptune, Pluto. So he's septile both to Neptune and Pluto. And he eventually went to live in Tahiti, where he became very disillusioned, because at that stage the natives were all dressed in European clothes, that Europeans had been in the South Pacific at that stage for about 70 to 80 years, and had really changed a lot of the customs. But a lot of his work is very dreamlike. As you can see in this one. And I think this is a real example of that Sun, Neptune, Pluto, the Sun, Pluto starting to come through. The very dark colours, a lot of intensity. He did a whole series of work which is generally just not shown, not seen around. And it's of totem figures that he did in Tahiti. He was very interested in magical and mystical kind of rites. And again, in the primitive aspects of society. And that, to me, is sort of capturing some of that. This is Degas, who was perhaps a little bit before some of the other people that we've been seeing. He was painting a lot in the 1880s and 1890s. Here's a Sun-Pluto septile, and this was considered quite an outrageous painting at the time that it was shown, because here we see a woman in a very unflattering position, with going about her toilet, going about her kind of daily or weekly cleaning ritual. The man is, it's called the pedicure, and he of course is cleaning her toenails. This is another one that created an absolute outrage. It's called absinthe, which is a type of alcohol which is no longer sold because it's very, very potent. And this is a set-up thing. This is an actress friend of his that he got to pose. But again, it was him showing the so-called senior side of society, which was frowned upon. In his very last series, he was all about women cleaning and bathing themselves, and some of the reviews that were done at the time, like in London, one prominent critic said it was that they were very objectionable. It was a bit like peering through a keyhole, peering into an intimate aspect of somebody's life. Now, of course, nudes have always been a subject of art throughout history, but it's often been in a very sort of idealized sort of way, whereas he seemed to kind of strip away some of that idealization. It's another one of a woman combing her hair. Picasso has a Sun-Pluto combination, and he really took, if you remember back to Cézanne, who had the Sun-Saturn aspect, which was the man who was very interested in the planes. Picasso really took that another stage further. In this one, obviously, you have a real life-death struggle. This is a cat eating a bird. Unfortunately, what happened in the preparation for this talk is a whole series of my slides are somewhere between here and Australia, including most of Picasso. But as you can see in the next work, is what he did is he started to really break down reality even further. And in his later work, well, in the Cubist period, often they don't seem to bear any relationship to reality at all. And again, it's trying to move beyond the outer structure and trying to sense what was lying underneath the structure. Henry Moore has a Sun-Pluto septile. And you know, the thing that often comes up to me is almost like looking at the bones of the earth when I look at his work. Again, you know, nothing very much to do with outer reality at all. Right. This is William Blake. Who has a Mercury-Neptune septile. And again, it was very interesting to see that a lot of his work was actually published in books, giving that kind of Mercury feel to them. But he's a real inspirational artist. He was quite revolutionary at his time. Nobody else was quite doing stuff like it. It's very dreamlike. He often refers back to the far distant past. This is called Anxiety.
What was the previous one called?
What was the previous one? I'm not sure. It was the frontispiece to a book. I forget the name of the book now. I can look that up for you. This is called Albion Rising, which Albion's meant to represent England rising. But again, you know, the use of colour and it's very sort of Mercury Neptune. This is the Simoniac Pope falling, which is he did illustrations for a lot of classical writers like Milton. A lot of his work is religious in its nature, a lot referring to the Old Testament. And there a soul is being whizzed past like the gates of heaven. And that's meant to be a pope there, suspended over hell. Obviously a pope who'd been evil in his way of thinking. This is Nebuchadnezzar. Never say these Old Testament names. Nebuchadnezzar, who was said to have gone insane after mistreating the Jews, and his hair was meant to have grown long, and his nails grew into claws, and you can see the great suffering in his eyes and his face. As well as an artist with that Mercury, Neptune, Septile, he was also a poet, and wrote quite a lot of poetry. I'd like to go perhaps backwards a little bit and look at a Mercury-Saturn septile. Krishnamurti again has a Mercury-Saturn septile, and one of his quotes is, "The question really is, how are we to live a highly intelligent, orderly life without any kind of effort?" Which is a really Mercury-Saturn feeling to me. And a very clear communicator. But for those of you who aren't familiar with him, he was chosen when very young by Annie Besant of the Theosophical Society, and Olcott, who was her co-leader of the Theosophical Society. Olcott saw Krishnamurti's aura and said that he was the next Messiah. And he was raised from that age in the Theosophical Society with that awareness that he was going to be the next Christ in a sense. And they were actually very worried about him when he was younger because he was very silent. Like they actually thought he might be a bit, like there were comments when you read some of the theosophical literature, that he might have been a bit stupid, a bit dim, which to me is again that often when you get Mercury-Saturn you get that kind of difficulty in putting into words that the inner awareness, the difficulty in expressing it. And he actually, I think, in his 30s, he rejected that Messiah role and started preaching to people that they had to look within themselves for their own answers. And so which really gives that feeling of it. Right, this is Venus-Neptune, Chagall. Very sort of whimsical, magical. A lot of his images seem to come from out of the collective unconscious. There's always people flying around in the skies, very rich symbolic colour. And it's interesting, he has done quite a lot of work where union is quite a strong theme, where his marriage or where his wife appears. Again, this is view from a Paris window, and you can see the Eiffel Tower in the background. You can see somebody floating down from heaven. See a cat with a man's face. Again, there's a very strong religious element in his work, but it's not in a traditional sense. I think, as with Blake, with the Mercury Neptune, it's actual a real experience of that oneness and a need to somehow express that. This is a woman's called Chris Mules in Auckland, who is has the Venus-Pluto septile, and that's sort of on its side there, but you'll get the idea that she's a potter, working with her hands, and she does a lot of mainly very ceremonial type of objects. Like they're bowls for worshipping, bowls for rituals really. And in typical kind of plutonic type colour, she uses blacks and reds a lot. Very kind of, again, magical, mystical kind of stuff, but at that very deep level of Pluto, I think, rather than that dreamlike Neptunian thing that we were looking at before. Another one who works. Van Gogh, Mars Saturn, and you know, he's a real tale of frustration. He didn't sell a single work, I think, during his lifetime, or very few if he did. For a long time, if you look at his earlier work, and I'll show some of his earlier work tomorrow, he really struggled to try and find, copy the old masters. He really wanted to get the structure right. And for years he battled away with it, and none of the work from that time is considered to be very significant at all. And then at some point what seemed to happen is he put aside so much worrying about the structure, but just tried to pour out all the energy of his soul onto the paper. And it's very much, in a lot of his work, like he's just manifesting energy. I mean, to me that's just almost pure energy. And
This is Venus.
he's got Mars Saturn. Mars Saturn. Enormous frustration in terms of expressing himself in his lifetime. He worked very fast once he threw away the need to structure things. This is a self-portrait done just. Gauguin actually visited him and stayed with him for a period of time, which was a very productive period for both of them, but their personalities really clashed. And it culminated in a horrendous argument, and Van Gogh was so remorseful about his actions that the next morning he got up and cut his ear off and handed it to Gauguin on a platter as a symbol of his remorse. You know, he struggled with kind of insanity, particularly in the latter part of his life. He has a lot of septiles, a lot of quintiles. Again, I think he just is trying to be the vehicle for so much kind of inspiration that it just didn't kind of work. Really.
What were the other septiles?
I'll look them up afterwards. Unfortunately, it's a bit hard with the light. This is actually painted about 20 days before his death. And it's called Crows Over a Wheat Field. And, you know, it often critics suggest that it's almost like premonition of his ending. The crows are very foreboding. There's nothing terribly pleasant about the sky. It's very black. In fact, it's to me very Saturn Mars. You know, there's the blacks of the moodiness, the depression of the horizon, and then there's all this energy underneath it in the reds and the yellows. He was very frustrated in his sexual life as well. For a while he was living with a prostitute who had a drug habit. He had to, in the end, abandon her because he just didn't have, he was so poor, he didn't have enough money to support her or the child that she had from a previous relationship. And it seemed really common, like it happened on a couple of other occasions where he fell in love or wanted to form a relationship, and it wasn't allowed by, say, the parents of the other person. Right, that's the end of the things. I wonder if we could have the lights on again, please. Okay, so I'd like to apologise a little bit in the sense that I'm not as clear as I would have liked to have been. I think the thing that really struck me when I started looking at all the artwork is that you can actually see quite a difference when you put the person's paintings together from the same period of time with the different aspects. What actually inspired them, the way in which they tried to express that inspiration, and particularly when you see from the Sun Saturn to the Sun Neptune, that kind of transition that's there. I had so much information that I was going to talk about, and it's all kind of got lost. I don't know, I'll blame Mercury retrograde if it's convenient, but perhaps it might be best if we just, if you just ask questions, and maybe we can take it from there. Do people get some sense of how they operate just from seeing the slides?
I thought it was a very brilliant way of illustrating the way that a septile can manifest. It was really well presented.
Have you seen now how the other septiles in the Van Gogh?
Van Gogh's chart, sure.
Because that's so complex that a number of different ones there.
Right.
So when you think of Loki and Mozart, they both had a lot of them.
Right.
And both had very productive and fraught lives.
Right. I think it's something that Jana once said to me, Jana who's an artist, that she said the consistent thing in artist charts that she's found is some kind of Sun-Saturn combination, because there's the need to give form to the inner spirit. And that was one of the commonest things. When I looked particularly at the quintile series, the Sun-Saturn comes up again and again and again. In the Sun, there weren't so many Sun-Saturn septiles, so Zahn was the only one out of all the artists that I looked at. Van Gogh actually only had the one septile, but he had quite a few quintiles. He had Moon-Saturn quintile, Sun-Saturn quintile, Sun-Moon quintile, and Mars-Pluto quintile. And I'm looking more at him and his work tomorrow in the quintile series.
Don't you think that it's a very interesting point that with the septiles, biseptile and triseptile and so on, that they are the one aspect that never divides evenly. It shades off into infinity, which is why because Neptune ruled is certainly makes a lot of sense. And septiles being aspects of destiny, being like that fine tuning that connects that person to the universe, as if they had some special destiny factor to perform while they're on the planet.
Yeah. Well, that seems to come through very strongly in all of these people's lives as somehow more being called out of them than just their own personal needs. Example which may be useful, I don't know, like from my own chart, I have a Mars-Saturn septile, similar to Pearl Van Gogh. I haven't experienced the difficult sides perhaps of that. But what happened as a naturopath in Auckland in sort of 83, 84, and I'm the only gay naturopath in Auckland, is that as the AIDS crisis broke, suddenly I was inundated with men, gay men, needing to make changes in their lives. My Saturn is in the second, so a lot of the issues that I've worked with are self-worth, and Mars is in the sixth, in Pisces. And I see that as a really positive way in which the Saturn-Mars septiles work for me. at the time I felt totally incompetent to deal with it. And yet people would turn up at my doorstep because I was the only one there, and right. That's one example. Isadora Duncan, who's a Sun-Moon Septile, her life was just full of fateful kind of incidents. Some of them quite horrendous, actually. But what she did, I think, is a really good example of the Sun and Moon. That as a woman, she really re-energized Western dance. What she wanted was to break out of the old kind of restricted way of moving and to follow the feelings. Again, to be inspired by the feelings, the Sun-Moon Septile. And she was very enamored with things from the past. In fact, in all the Sun-Moon Septiles, Blavatsky, Wagner, Blake and Isadora Duncan all have in common a fascination with very ancient kind of knowledge and symbols. And they use that as a source of inspiration for themselves.
Do you have something to say about Beethoven?
Yes and no. I've got. I was going to play Beethoven's Ode to Joy, which I've actually taped. And he was a son, amongst many other things. He has about 5 or 6 of the Septile Quintile series. He has a Sun Neptune Septile, and there was a lovely quote that he made about inspiration that Michael and I crowed over when we found it. He was a child prodigy, and he was taken around the courts and would play in front of them at a very early age. And the criticism that he got was that he improvised too much. And at the same time, that was the most praise that he got also, because he became incredibly inspirational when he did improvise. And the quote that he said was, "Real improvisation comes only when one is unconcerned what one plays. So if one wants to improvise in the best and truest manner in public, one should give oneself over freely to what comes to one." Which again is that lovely Sun Neptune energy coming through. I found it really interesting in terms of the Second World War that Churchill, Mussolini, and Pius XII all have Sun-Mars Septile combinations. Pius XII was the Pope in the Vatican that suddenly had to try and deal with Mussolini and Hitler. It was like having to again rise to the occasion in a time of conflict. Mussolini, I would see as largely a negative example of the Sun-Mars Septile, in that he was into fascism and to a lot of brutality. It was a real misuse of will in his case.
Not a lot of enduring monuments, which are not particularly aesthetic.
Right.
Actually, Gary, just as a matter of interest, I've got a son, Mars Septile, and my Mars is in the 12th house conjunct Venus. One of the things that brought into my life without question, because I was living in a campong in the middle of nowhere in Singapore, and this person came up looking for me. That she led me to learn Tai Chi, martial arts, and I was sort of really one of the first people to bring Tai Chi back here to New Zealand. And when I arrived back in New Zealand in 1978, there was a very big music festival in Bassam. There was like 60,000 people there.
Right. That's wonderful. Thank you. And you often seem to find that the person having to somehow respond to a situation and providing a real sort of seeding service really for other people. They're very strong in priests' chart. The only Catholic priest that's come along to me to do a chart, you may have other examples, had 7 Septile in his chart. Just shocking. He's also a very good artist. In fact, if he wasn't, probably, he could have probably been one of New Zealand's better artists if he focused on that. But there is an element of sacrifice involved with the Septile. That often the more personal concerns are often have to be put aside for the universal. That's one way in which he showed that. Krishnamurti is also a Sun Mars, as we said, and again he's a very positive side of that. An interesting one is Moon Pluto, and Lenin as a Moon Pluto Septile. And even Russian historians, when they write about Lenin, say there's one quote which went somewhere along the lines, how could a person be so important to our nation and we know so little about him? That he had enormous effect on the masses, and yet was almost like totally cloaked in secrecy. He has a Scorpio ascendant as well, which would help.
Very mysterious figure, isn't he? Nobody knows how he actually got there in the first place.
Right. Well, he seemed to have an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right time. He lived for a long time overseas in exile, and then there was a real ferment happening in Russia about the time of the revolution, and he was the only one. There were lots of different parties around at that time, any of who could really have taken power, and he was the only one that seemed to sense that it was time for the Soviet party to intervene, and he returned from overseas to be part of that. The mass adulation after his death. I mean, his tomb was on, his coffin was on display for a very long period of time, and just millions of Russians, probably not millions, but thousands of Russians, going past to pay homage to him. Very negative use of Moon Pluto too. I mean, he was a very manipulative person who constantly fought with the people, with his protégés. He was always involved in little power struggles, trying to come out on top, and in a very sort of underhand sort of way. It was always sort of things were going on behind the scenes to depose somebody else. I actually had Stalin's chart as well, which is very interesting. Right. Well, there is hope, yeah. The thing that amazed me about Stalin's chart is, if you look at it, it is actually full of very positive aspects. It's got some wonderful positive. It's got a kite involving Uranus, Neptune.
Yeah, no difficulty in murdering lots of people.
Yeah. And yet when you look at the quintiles, particularly, I think, in this chart, I can't remember, I think it's the quintiles, they're, he also has a lot of willpower there. And I think, I'll look that up tomorrow. I'll look it up. Here's a trine of, grand trine of Sun, Neptune, Mars, Uranus. So it was a really good vehicle for the new revolutionary doctrines that came out at the time. Marxism is a real Uranus-Neptune kind of doctrine. It professes to be anti-God, and yet it has a really religious feeling about it. They've really replaced the state, replaced religion by the state. So he's a perfect, person to do it. Also, doesn't have a kite. He has a quintile series involving Saturn, Mars, Moon, and Mercury. I think it's the Saturn, Mars, Moon particularly, where he could be very brutal. Saturn, Mars, I think, potentially is quite a brutal combination, and involved with the Moon as well, with the masses. I mean, there were, probably near a million people.
He apparently killed more people than killed in concentration camps many times over.
They say he killed more people before the Second World War than were killed more Russians before the Second World War than were killed Syrians.
Enormous emotional insecurity, I think, that Saturn, Moon, Mars quintile series. Negatively, really, an insecure Saturn, Mars male is always trying to show off his masculinity, to show his force, to
The old bull.
yeah, and he seems to have sort of projected that.
Gary, just one question. What order do you allow for the septile?
I normally allow 1.5 degrees.
You allow 1.5?
Yeah.
Oh,
Right. Well, Addie allows 2 to 3, which I sort of compromise. I'd always, I think it's good to use tide orbs with them, but also what's come out a lot is that they are incredibly important. In a lot of artists' charts, they're almost the only thing that is makes sense in terms of the artistic success that they might have had. Example that comes to mind is recently a man came to me who wanted his chart done, and we wanted particularly to talk about career type things, and I looked at his career, and he told me that he was a sculptor, and he's got Leo in midheaven, Sun in Taurus in the second, and I thought, well, that might sort of fit if you bend it around a little bit, that he might be wanting to mould the earth in some way. But what really came to light was when I looked at the quintiles, he had 4 quintiles to Saturn in the 6th. He worked with stone, and what he'd done to make a living for the last 12, 14 years is that he'd made stone walls. He'd been a landscape gardener, which is a real combination of that Taurus in the 2nd with the Saturn in the 6th in this case. Sorry? Right. And there were very few aspects to Saturn. There was a trine, one trine, something like that, but nothing involving the career, unless you looked at the quintiles.
What you were saying that Saturn, Mars for artists paralleled by Venus, Saturn, musicians. Prominent musicians, almost invariably have strong Venus, Saturn.
Right. Right. Well, Verdi is a Venus-Saturn combination. Are there any questions? Any other questions? Other examples: Mars, Jupiter, Septile, which you'd expect me to be involved in some inspirational way in terms of, again, of motivating people, particularly if you have some sort of belief system that you want to motivate other people about. Blake and Isadora Duncan were the only two that I came across. And Blake was, talk about proselytise. I mean, he had this philosophy, and he was going to, get it across to people. There's a lovely story about Blake. He was very eccentric, as the Sun Uranus shows. His neighbour one day came to visit the Blake household, and him and his wife were sitting in the garden naked reading a book. The neighbour, of course, was horrified, and Blake then explained that he was reading Paradise Lost by Milton, and the particular passage was describing the Garden of Eden, and they both thought that they'd be able to get more into the spirit of things by sitting there naked.
Where was this made?
Right.
That was the neighbour that came.
And Isadora Duncan likewise, travelled a lot trying to disseminate her ideas and get the information across.
She's very zealous and promoting her ideas down the process.
Yeah, I mean, she tended to get people's back up a bit, I gather, because she was so over the top. But that's certainly that Mars Jupiter energy. It would be. I didn't do it. It was one that was sort of there on. I got to a stage it was sort of ridiculous. I just think, oh gosh, I must look at Salvador Dali, and I must look at, Einstein's chart. I think, again, it's got something like 17 in the Septile and Quintile series. Enormous amount. Mainly in the Quintile, but he has got quite a few Septile, and he was, the first to admit that his insights didn't come from the rational process, that he was inspired, that the answers came to him. Sorry? Well, very much that's the Septile, Neptunian feeling too. I did probably. I did a number of writers, and it's a bit limited in the sense that what I focused on were artists, writers, religious people, and murderers. I didn't talk about murderers. Starlet, my son. Yeah. That actually comes up much more in the Quintile series. In fact, none of the murderers, unless you count Hitler and Stalin. Hitler and Stalin are the only two that came up in the Septile series, but the Quintile series does seem to have. It's got quite a reputation for coming up in the charts of abuse victims, people who are victims of abuse, or those people that push their will onto other people. That's the negative side of it, the really positive side of it. Yeah, Wagner, what Liz Green's feeling was that his music directly addresses one's unconscious, and it had an enormous impact on the thought on the Germans of the 20s and 30s. Hitler, for instance, loved his music. I guess partly because Wagner was so anti-Jewish himself. But there's a real sort of Superman vision that comes out of Wagner. Yeah, Aaron Race, right. Yes, in fact, there's a horrible little quote somewhere where he actually wrote an article more or less saying that Arans were superior and all other races were by nature inferior. Extraordinary stuff that he came up with. He has a Sun-Moon septile. I don't think those are necessary of that. He has a Sun-Pluto quintile, and that's where the real nasty stuff comes out. Boy, got lots of stories about him. Sun-Pluto.
It's interesting you mentioned someone on the back there with Pluto. It was Mars Pluto quintile. Was that with Van Gogh?
Thank God, yeah.
Right. And the interesting thing is it was seen
Pluto. Again, Kandinsky, who's this wonderful visionary artist, love, is somewhere over halfway between here and Australia. But one of the quotes that I thought was really interesting from his writing, he has a Mercury-Pluto triseptile. Whatever traces of representation his works contain are quite involuntary. His aim was to charge form and colour with a purely spiritual meaning by eliminating all resemblance to the physical world. That isn't actually a quote from him, that's somebody writing about his work. In his own writings, he spoke a lot about that the form that the spirit takes at any time is only the form and will need to be dropped to make way for the next form that the spirit is going to take. So the form is only a vehicle, and there's very much that Mercury-Pluto ability to really perceive the nature, and to let go.
Rocking the form, that's very much the image of the snake shedding its skin, isn't it? Pluto contact with wildness that you just described is interesting. The significance seems to me, like what I'm getting from it, is that it's not so much the quintile, it's the actual Sun-Pluto contact that's coming through. The quintile is hardly colouring at all. In other words, it's just acting as almost a pure channel.
Yeah. I think that's what happens is when people aren't kind of, again, conscious of themselves and of their processes, is that the collective unconscious just uses them, like it's and the more unpleasant aspects of the collective unconscious may just emerge through them, as well as the more positive.
That's a lesson for interpretation, though, because when I've first got into minor aspects in the early 1980s, I noticed there was very little agreement on what the keywords to sum up their ascension in nature. And like Paddy's followers in Britain were describing the quintile in terms of creativity, and I noticed earlier on you used that word creativity for Septile, which illustrates that. But obviously it's a lack of consensus on what the minor aspects, how they should be interpreted, is possibly linked to the fact that they're more of just a channel between the planetary, the two ends of the aspect, and not so much from the aspect of sun.
Yeah, that was my feeling. Like doing the Septile and Quintile series, I was really struggling. I was sort of thinking, well, how on earth is the Sun-Pluto Septile different from the Sun-Pluto Quintile? Because in most of the people's lives that I looked at, there was great similarity in terms of how they were expressed. My feeling is with the Septiles, they often involve more of a surrender too. The Septiles are, by their nature, more inspirational and more about surrender, whereas the Quintiles often seem to involve the use of the will more. The person often tries to channel it with their will, to try and utilize it in some way.
Creativity is different in that source is different. Like Septile sounds like very Neptunian kind of creativity, whereas the Quintile is more Dragon. Just the source of it rather than how it's delivered.
Right. Eddie himself tries to avoid using creativity for the Quintile series. He sees inspiration and creativity more to do with the Septile series. But he only manages to avoid using that word with great difficulty and really trusts himself in not to use it.
This book, Harmonic Charts, goes very strongly into the using of creativity.
Right.
Well,
Yeah.
my favourite understanding was that, and seems to be this one, is that the Septiles are very much aspects of destiny, and the destiny does require some sort of surrendering or some sort of invasion in a way.
Right. Yeah, good idea.
Destiny. And the Quintiles, like destiny, imply
are needed to overcome the domination of the five senses. The quintiles for me are a lot to do with the ability to visualize something in your mind, within yourself. You know, the quintiles almost before an artist creates something, you have to have some kind of idea or vision of what you want to create and what materials might be needed to create with. And that's how the quintile works. It also, I have a real feeling of sort of hermetic magic with quintiles. That it's that ability to creatively visualize something within your mind, and then to almost have a holistic perspective about something, and to see the things that need to be acted upon. Whereas the septiles doesn't really have that feeling at all. It's what calls you, what really moves you, what inspires you, so there's a difference there, but it's often very hard to see that in terms of external representation.
There seems to be a lot of power drive in the world there.
Yeah. The use and abuse of power is also added, summarised as the quintiles. The use and abuse of power. It's the parts. It's what you have power over in your life. Is what the quintiles are, and what you're master of. Which the septiles don't have that feeling at all to me. You know, like you're more mastered by your vehicle. Right. Yeah. Yeah. With the quintile, there often is that more drive to understand mentally. The septiles, particularly again when you look at the artist, is often the people with the artists with septiles aren't terribly good about describing what the process is for them. Whereas the quintiles often seem to be better. Not always, but unless there's an aspect involving Mercury with a septile, like the Krishnamurti and that septile. About finding them, yes, good point. Septile's 51 degrees and 25 minutes. That's the septile. A biseptile is 102 degrees and 50 minutes. And a triseptile is 54, 15. 154.15. Okay.
The moral there is to have titles for quintiles. Otherwise you get confused.
Well, the quintiles being a faithful aspect, isn't it? However, astrology and so on, it's interesting, it's borderline between the two. We try and set up a cooperation together.
That's what program only allows the degree to. Well, that could be also a Alan Oaken claims has it starting allowing a far wider walk for Winco because he sees them effective beyond he might be seeing something other than Winco.
I think so, yeah. That's my sense.
Not only that, a lot of American astrologers do the quintiles, and I do.
It's our part, so unless there's any other questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tomorrow's example.
I know.
When Delphine Jane was out in '79, she was doing a lot of work on quintiles, septiles and stuff.
That's your book.
79.
Yeah, and I believe she actually followed it up with articles. And I've got quite a few notes on what she gave me about septiles and the families and